briefly, I think my audience would be interested. You're sort of former ex-IDW kind of, right?
I mean, I was always adjacent. It was kind of behind the scenes, but I think like the way to, go ahead.
You were close with Sam Harris and
yes, I still am. Although it's a strained relationship. I made a film with him. I wrote a 10-part series based like on his entire show. I feel like I was an archivist basically for his show. I did this 10-part series called The Essential Sam Harris, which was a cool idea of like someone who has a decade-long catalog of shows, and newcomers who are discovering him, like, aren't going to go through the whole thing. It was kind of a way to like crash course how this guy thinks on different topics. So that there was like one on free will and one on AI, one on consciousness and that stuff. So like I feel like I know his argument inside and out. But the way to put that with the IDW stuff is I cared very deeply, and still do, about those audiences, the people who were showing up interested in this thing, asking questions, trying to, poke at maybe taboo subjects and stuff. And I was probably, like most people, just constantly disappointed by the unseriousness of which the people on the stages were treating the audience, and grew more and more frustrated. And, it fizzled. And I think, it was a shame that it just sort of fizzled into a bunch of garbage. I think Brett Weinstein on Dave Rubin's show ages ago, when he was first coming out, said the sentence to Dave that truth seeking will not survive market forces. And I think that kind of summarizes, the forecast of the downfall of the entire thing. But I was always behind the scenes and making films and trying to organize things and helping things out. And after October 7th, I decided I should be less behind the scenes and jump on stage, because it was just too important at that point. But that's a bit of my background. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I was telling you, I regard you as one of the more level-headed thinkers on the whole Israel-Palestine subject, but and we can get into that maybe later. But I mean, would you consider yourself a leftist philosopher? Is that a
Yeah, I mean, I studied philosophy. I got a degree in film, but it's been, I tell the story in one of my essays, just a lifelong sort of journey in philosophy, and I'm writing a book now. And still just discovering my way through it and finding it. But that's fair. I mean, I don't like the labels, just like you as well. But I think I could walk that balance beam. Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, then let's just start with this then. Given my radical centrism, or my moderate anti-centrism, or my PF Jungianism, whatever we call it, I don't call myself a leftist. But I read your article about neoliberalism, and we certainly agree there. I do think that one of the reasons I'm radical is because I regard the neoliberal status quo as a good enough tool for getting us here. I mean, we have fancy technology, and I'm not starving, but it seems obvious to me that things are going to not fix themselves in the future, and that this obsession with like freedom and material wealth even is not functional. But I wouldn't call myself a leftist, because I still, in some sense, I appreciate the anti-consumerist spiritualist mentality of the right. And I think that we need religious structures and we need restrictions on freedom in order to produce meaning and actually produce more freedom. But what is your thesis as a leftist? What is your defense of leftism?
Yeah, no, I really like that, what you just said, actually. And it's before we could talk about the right, and I think what you hinted at there, what I like about that already is that, and you read that thing I'm working on, but that I can always talk to people who admit that there's a problem, right? Like I'm an atheist, but I have the best conversations with religious people oftentimes, because at the very start, we are in mutual agreement that there's a problem of existence, of being thrown into an existence without manual, with moral chaos and everything. So, I obviously come to a different answer than them, but we can start that there's a problem. And I think that analogy holds with something like neoliberalism, where I'm trying to, I could talk to people who admit or agree, like you just sort of hinted at, that this thing, and we could define it more directly, I guess, neoliberalism, that there's a problem even to solve here. There's a problem to address. And it's potentially a spiritual problem, not just a sort of pragmatic problem. Because I think like there's two ways to approach what you just laid out and why I think I'm a leftist, or why I would say I'm a leftist. And one is this like pragmatic view of things, which is like, people could talk about inequality and call it a problem, but it's a problem. They view it as a problem insofar as like, if it gets so bad, there'll be a revolt and the whole thing will crumble. And so we have to keep inequality in check, right? Like
which
there's
is,
like a consequence.
which is sort of what Jordan Peterson says.
Okay, yeah, you'll have to represent him. Yeah. And then I think there's a different angle to that. There's a different moral philosophy. That would be more like a consequentialist utilitarian, like, hey, this balance is out of whack and the whole thing's going to crumble like a house of cards unless you take care of the bottom row, whatever. Or it's just a inherent immoral like thing, inequality, right? Regardless of the consequences, it's just its own sort of immoral. I think you could get there secularly, you could get there religiously, whatever, but it's its own kind of evil. It's its own kind of wrong that just needs to be approached and fixed directly. And I think you could be a leftist in both directions, but it's probably more the latter. But like for example, here's what I think makes a leftist. I think every political theory, every political philosophy is ultimately at its base a theory about the nature of man. I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about politics, of like how this creature, man, can arrange itself in such a way to achieve something. Now, like I just put the word achieve there, like what you're aiming for, what the end goal of the universe or the world or society is. That's an important conversation for leftism as well. And I think that will open up the door to the neoliberal conversation of like, are we just trying to gain material wealth for its own sake? Or are we trying to, play the game of existence by maximizing love and, justice and whatever in this other, and those are important conversations to have, but I just want to like bracket that for a second, because if you decide you want to achieve something individually or as a collective species, society, and it's really worthwhile, set that aside, what that means. The leftist position about the theory of man is that a prerequisite for anything you're going to achieve requires a sufficiently satisfied sense of justice. And that's why leftists are always talking about justice so much rather than peace, right? Like the utilitarians,
no justice, no peace, right?
No justice, no peace. And I, like people hear that as a threat, right? Which maybe it is, but I think the true leftist is like, it's not a threat, dude. It's just the way we are as a species. It's like, we need it. And again, so there's a way to say, without a satisfied sense of justice, no matter what you build on top of it, no matter how many, toys you throw at the thing and how much neoliberalism and capitalism you heap upon the thing or whatever, that gnawing sense of injustice won't go away and will eventually surface to bring the entire structure down. So that's the consequentialist, like, it won't hold because of sort of the poisoned well at the beginning of the project. Or again, it's just sort of an inherent wrong that our mission, our goal, and this is more of like a spiritual sense, is to create just worlds rather than technologically advanced worlds. And finding the convergence of those two things obviously is maybe where you could give birth to your radical centrism idea of like, and that's beautiful. Yeah. So that's a start of the answer. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I agree. The question of human nature is fundamental here, and what is morality. So I wonder if there's a significant difference between justice and fairness, because I think one of the most interesting insights from like the maps of meaning kind of framework that I am an adherent to is that human beings, that you said there's like an innate sense of justice. I believe that's true. Like animals can exhibit a sense of fair play. Right. So like what Peterson talks about is we know that, or it's reasonable to believe that morality is built into us because we see it in animals with a sense of fair play, where like when a wolf fights another wolf and it loses, it turns its head over and exposes its neck, and the other wolf doesn't bite it. And it's a sense of like, well, I beat you and I'm submitting. You know, he gives the example of rats wrestling. A big rat can always beat a little rat, but the big rat will let the little rat win in repeated wrestling bouts just to be able to play the game, right? So there's a built-in sense of fairness. So the idea that there's an innate sense or instinct, to put it like biologically, for justice and for fairness, I buy that. And so I guess, why don't you call yourself a radical? Why don't you just read Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning and get out of this leftist nonsense? Right, stop associating with the woke.
Well, we could get to the woke stuff later, but I like that, and I'll tell you where I differ with what, and it's pretty nuanced here, but it's important, and why I would find my way through that thought experiment as a humanist and a secular humanist, rather than, I think Jordan calls himself a pragmatist and Christian pragmatist.
Christian adjacent, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you ever read the William James pragmatism stuff, it's actually an interesting philosophy.
Yeah.
Anyway, he gets the best, about truth and all that. But so what I think is I think Jordan and other thinkers like him lean into evolution and nature in a way that I don't. And this is, I'll draw my way through the humanism here and distinguish it. Is that, so Franz de Waal is a really good writer who's done a ton of this work. I don't know, he wrote a really good book called The Atheist and the Bonobo. He's done a ton of these experiments on fair play and morality, and even like pseudo religion emerging in animal really cool stuff.
Yeah, Peterson cites him all the time.
Oh, great. Yeah. And Franz, by the way, hates all the new atheist IDW people. But so here's what I think. Is I view man as separate or distinct, a special kind of existential awareness that the non-human animals don't have. I'll say persons here rather than man. We're here on Earth. I'm sort of borrowing from David Deutsch here, but persons in general as a sort of a phenomenological thing. And the thing that persons have that something like a rat or a lion doesn't have is an existential kind of second order desires, would be a way to put it. It's the ability to ask not just what do I want, and not to be geared or driven entirely by your genetics or your deterministic factors, but to ask, what do I want to want? And it's this second order kind of conversation that you could have with yourself. So I always put it this way, that, a lion, he uses rats, I guess, but a lion feels an urge. We can do play or hunting or whatever, but feels an urge to eat a gazelle. Like, it's hungry, there's a gazelle, I'm going to go get it. And it does amazing, beautiful, intelligent, really smart things to do that, hunts and packs. Like, we know all the amazing things that evolution can gear within us. And I fully grant them a consciousness that's meaningful and deep and has valence and all that. But the lion cannot ask the question, do I want to eat a gazelle, right? It feels the urge and it does it. Where man can. And I think out of this tension about our, deterministic urges and our desires, and then this question of what kind of man do I want to be? Do I want to feel this kind of urge? That's in that tension, in that strife, in that impossible questioning springs art and artistic expression. And I'm giving that in a very, like, art is a really interesting way to think about the man. I sometimes call man the artistic animal. If you saw a lion in this, like, let alone that they don't have thumbs or whatever, but like painting a portrait of itself in the savannah or something, or like scratching something in the tree or whatever that was like a lion cub and like staring at it or whatever. And elephants you can train to sort of do this magic trick, but they're not really doing it. I feel like you would look at that lion and be like, wait a second, like that lion, you might not want to eat it. You might not want to kill it. You might be like, that lion is thinking about its own existence in a very different way.
It ate some mushrooms or something by accident.
Maybe we should, try to see if we can induce this. But man does. And so art in the sense of an act that is purely out of that anxiety of sort of, why do I exist and what kind of existence should I be and what is a good existence? Artistic expression of certain kinds of music or painting or art or just whatever kind of it is, that if it's like abstractly we can understand this. It escapes all evolutionary descriptions or motivations. It's, like when animals are playing or whatever, you could always call it pro-social, and they're rehearsing for later in life or whatever. And of course, there's plenty of artists who you look at and it's like, well, the true motivation is they're just trying to get laid and raise their status. And it's like, right. So like art is this thing that's always corrupted. All of this can be potentially corrupted. This will open the door to the neoliberalism thing, where pure neoliberalism or capitalism, like art is irrational in this sense, right? It's not self-interested. It's like wasted energy yelling at God, basically, why do I exist? And I think that's where Peterson and I would diverge in this way, and we could get to where he thinks my way would be dangerous, and where his is, he leans on the animal kingdom all that, him better than I do, but he leans into these things much more than I do. And I do distinguish man as the moral animal, the artistic animal, the animal that can question these kinds of things. And then just one more thing to throw on your plate before you respond too, because to the justice thing, I also want to be, I'm sure we'll walk towards more like the obvious political injustices in the world or whatever, but I also want to just put this on the plate, what I just said there. I think the conditions to feel injustice is existence itself. I don't think you need to have like harmed or have the, Israel take your land, or, what happens in the Congo or whatever. I think I didn't ask to exist. I don't know about you, Paul, but like here I am in this world. Yeah. I didn't ask to be here. And I feel like a cosmic injustice was done to force existence upon me without we're in a place where good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, and it's chaotic. And so I think just existence itself is already the condition to feel an injustice. And just to put that on your plate then, because I want to, maybe that, the way I'm describing the leftist kind of philosophy and journey, where I'm saying, well, a satisfied sense of justice is a prerequisite to do anything. I hope you could tie those two threads together to be like, I'm talking about an individual journey that's eternal and will never really change against ourselves, right? Like you exist and it's an injustice and you have to satisfy it somehow if you're going to achieve anything. And you really never can, in my view. It's like an infinite horizon that's always going forever, but that's the target. And I think that individual spiritual thing that I just kind of laid out, you can sociologically scale it up to worlds and humans and society. And those, I think, are the pursuits worth pursuing. And I'll leave it there, because I think obviously that opens up the door towards why I and you and many, many other people are feeling the target of neoliberalism, which is just a blind kind of machine of free market economics that is self-correcting, supposedly, is not even driving towards a truly human place. It might be very much favoring our first order desires and not engaging in the second order desires.
The telos is drive down the price of TVs as much as possible and say that that's the objective good or something like that. I mean, it's funny. I used to be hardcore libertarian. Milton Friedman was the first person I ever came across the old YouTube videos in college, and I was like,
I'm glad you found your way out of it.
Yeah, well, I was like, hold on, he's literally never lost an argument, because everything he says is so logical. Yeah, I've never heard him. He always has a logical response, and it was only over time that I realized, well, what are the assumptions something can be logical and incorrect depending on your starting axioms. Like, all humans deserve to die. Therefore, it's logical to gas them and whatever. Like, the logic can play out however you want, depending on your axioms, right? Your axioms just point you in whatever direction, and then logic takes you in that direction. And with Milton Friedman, or with libertarianism in general, and I would say neoliberalism is sort of kind of a libertarian economic mindset.
Yes, very much so. Neoliberalism, can I just pin that there? Because I think neoliberal, as we're using the word a lot, in case, just so people know how I want to use it, Wendy Brown, I think, is the best philosopher at the moment that I've been discovering, who talks really well about this stuff. Wendy Brown, she wrote a book about, she writes about Foucault, and she's writing a book about, I think it's sort of the Trumpian moment as nihilism, but she basically describes neoliberalism as market rationality and market reasoning, the kind of thing you were just referring to with Milton. And Milton might just be talking about financial markets, but neoliberalism was taking that same type of market reasoning and rationality, and it bled, or it engulfed other areas like morality or even romance or dating or whatever. And it kind of, everything became the rationality of market and status seeking and collecting. Like, well, anyway, you sort of get it. But that's what I mean by neoliberalism, as opposed to just financial libertarianism. Yeah.
Okay, I wrote something down that we can come back to in a sec, just on that.
Sure.
But the assumption of libertarianism was, well, the reduced cost of material goods is the ultimate thing. And like, on one hand, yeah, like I was saying earlier, like I appreciate the neoliberal perspective for getting us this far, right? But at a certain point, driving down the cost of my giant 48-inch flat screen TV does not produce any marginal utility, which of course, and also in the libertarian economic mindset, this concept of utility, it's like, it's this magical, the thing that everyone wants. It's like, well, what if that's corrupted? Or how do we know that your short-term consumerist desires, that's utility versus like long-term meaning and, connection and all that stuff. But Milton Friedman never lost an argument because he was just logical based on those, assumptions and whatnot. Now, I guess there's two ways we can go here. Well, let's stay on this point, the neoliberalism point. Because like, I would say one of and this, I don't know, because you call yourself a leftist, and I know leftists would disagree with me here, but like, one thing I think is an example of sort of the neoliberal mentality encroaching on things outside of just, commodities, is like the commodification of human intimacy with like things like OnlyFans or pornography, even in general. It's like there's a tension here of like, well, we want to have maximal freedom, right? Sex workers should have freedom to pursue what they want. But then on the other hand, it's like, well, how much of that is just,
right?
There's the freedom of the sex worker, but then there's the commodification and the productizing of intimacy, and how would you as a leftist just resolve that tension? You have some people on your side, quote unquote, well, we need, sex workers work, people should be able to pursue it with freedom. And any attacks on this is misogynistic or reducing freedom, versus hey, this is clearly a commodifying force underneath a lot of this. How would you resolve that tension?
Well, it's a tough one, because it kind of, I'll bite the bullet. It forces the question about, and this is a very like anti-libertarian and difficult thing. It's why I would lose all the arguments, that people don't always know exactly what they really want. And then you end up with these paternalistic, well, who knows better than you or whatever. And so, I mean, for example, so my favorite thinker is Erich Fromm. I don't know if you're Erich Fromm. He's the sociologist. His big hit was The Art of Loving, but his best book is called Escape from Freedom. It was written in the early 60s, I think. And it was first entitled The Fear of Freedom. He's a Frankfurt School German, and he wrote in English, but also German. And I think like this harkens back to my thing about existence itself as a form of injustice, but freedom is this word, you just used it a bunch there too, that everyone claims they want, and it's what everyone's trying to, unleash or maximize or liberate or whatever. And the title of the book, gives away the thesis of Escape from Freedom, is that actually freedom itself is a really frightening, terrifying, kind of difficult position. And we're constantly looking for ways out of it, to be told that we have no other choice, or, this is what we really want, or we're, just kind of just keep your head down and follow the crowd. And though I think like the tension of the kinds of freedom and our self-worth and what we really want are underneath a lot of that stuff. Like, I mean, I don't feel that strongly about the specific issue you brought up as from like a political, I don't have like a political sort of subscription or prescription for it, but philosophically, I would say, obviously there's like, I think there's, I outed myself as a humanist and got into that a little bit more, that the behavior itself of the sex worker in that example is a kind of inherently, let's call it less than free sort of behavior and less than sort of human flourishing maximization. I don't really care that much about what they're doing, I think there's probably just a lot of like philosophical self-harm going on there.
And is that just based on, like what we know about psychoanalysis and psychology of like, I mean, it's like, it's not a coincidence that a lot of women who end up in porn or whatnot have like broken, homes, and the men too. That's not exclusive to the women for sure.
Yeah, of course.
There's happen to be more models and all that. But like, is that, I mean, is that what you're, because I'm just trying to represent the, what the pro-freedom libertarian socialist side would be, which is a strain of leftism I'm very against, so to speak, because it is what I regard as just hedonism in terms of like, well, freedom just means pursuing my short-term or whatever I want in the moment versus like, is Eric Fromm the one that coined positive and negative freedom, or
he talked about that a lot. I think that he did. That might be him. I should ask my wife. She knows exactly what that. It might be Max Weber, but it's in the Frankfurt School for sure.
Yeah, because when I encountered that distinction for the first time, I was like, oh, here's the issue. Yeah, like you just said, everyone's trying to maximize freedom and all these different things, but positive freedom, positive freedom is the freedom to pursue, to do like higher order ends. Yeah, whereas negative freedom is the freedom from, like restraint and the government telling you what to do and stuff. And obviously, you need some level of both. But I do think, I guess if I were to label my fundamental problem with neoliberalism and libertarianism, it's they conceive of freedom mostly from a negative freedom perspective. Yeah. And I view it as, well, if we're going to have freedom and we're going to maximize freedom, we need to maximize positive freedom, which I would call meaning more so than freedom.
I like that. Yeah. Yes, I think that was very well said. I'll say, like, I think maybe a nice summation of it is back when I was on Twitter and I, was a terrible time. I left it years ago, but there was a couple of things that I would say that I think would catch on. And one of them that I think when I was often in philosophical arguments and engagements with libertarians who were friends, people like Nick Gillespie and stuff. But I would say this line that I think everyone intuitively understood, where I said, sometimes we're begging the market not to produce something that we can't resist. And I think in that truth, people can understand that tension, right? Like, and I think what you just talked about with pornography and, I mean, the crisis of men and whatever's happening in sex at the moment and stuff is probably one of those. Like, the market is not God. And obviously, I mean, this is the neoliberal. If I gave the leftist humanist theory of man that had justice as a prerequisite, and also folded in that we are the transcendent animal, and like this is the place where those conversations happen. The neoliberal or libertarian theory of man is this perfectly rational, autonomous creature who knows what it wants and does what it wants, and then the market is a reflection of what it truly wants. This is the revealed intentions versus stated intentions kind of stuff. And I think, like, I was looking at some polling because I'm writing this book and I'm trying to collect this data. I was looking at this polling of they were asking all these, I think Gallup did it, or one of the big ones. They were asking all these different age groups about their relationship with technology. And across the board, from even like the Gen Z kids and younger, millennials, everyone else, it was something like 67% of people said they wish they could go back to a time before they were so plugged into technology. Yeah,
it's like 50% of people on TikTok are like, I wish TikTok didn't exist.
Right. I mean, the Twitter one, the funny joke, it would always get a ton of likes when everyone would do it. It would be like, someone please ban me from this site. And it's like, you get the joke being like, well, you could just log off. But no, like there's truth in that of like, who said that we are generating the world that we really, truly want? And because our fears rule us just as much as our love does. It's like we're not some sort of perfectly rational animal. And, I'm always talking about stated intentions versus revealed intentions. And there was a friend of mine who I met in New York, Seth Stephens-Davidowitz, wrote a really great book called Everybody Lies years ago. He was a Google data analyst, and he wrote this amazing book. He had like access to all the data from Google search engines and Pornhub and like Facebook and all this stuff. And it was in this window, frankly, that probably closed, where he said, the Google search bar was like digital truth serum. Like nobody was watching and you actually asked what you wanted to ask in there. Yeah. People now, I think, know. Yeah, I think people now probably are moderating their own searches a bit.
Right.
But that data, whether it's closed or not, was just like amazing insight into, I think he was right, this digital truth serum. And in all the stuff he could discover, of course, the book is called Everybody Lies, is that tons of people, and not just the silly stuff, like you go on a vacation and you're posting how great it is, but really the Google search results is like, why is my wife cheating on me, or why aren't we having sex, or like how to get a divorce. Like that's kind of the obvious double life kind of stuff. And some of the data is incredibly important and just like won't show up. So for example, it was around the recession in 2008. Everyone was worried about domestic violence going up and child abuse going up, because it always goes up whenever there's like economic crisis. And then it just didn't seem to be happening because they were collecting all the data from like CPS and other sort of reporting agencies, and it wasn't really showing up. And everyone's like, oh, wow, like, there's really not a problem. But the Google search results for things like, why is daddy hitting me, were like through the roof in certain areas and so like some of the data is actually incredibly important. Or imagine like the data of like, what do people search for in a very specific pattern before they attempt suicide? Like these are like really important pieces of data that were showing up that no one was really keeping an eye on. So it was an amazing book. But to your point about neoliberalism and this market stuff, is things like he writes this chapter on all these, companies that are majorly successful that basically are working on secrets of. So the big one he writes about is like when Facebook changed their wall, or whatever it used to be called, to the news feed. It's like 2009. I don't know how long ago it was. But the wall before that was just literally chronological, just your friends and friends. There was no like algorithm behind it. And then suddenly they take away the wall and they put this news feed in, and it has like some news stories and it's algorithmic. Suddenly you're seeing people who you might not know or follow. And we all know now it's geared to like piss you off, excite you, get you to click, whatever. And everybody was panning and saying, this is the worst thing. I hate it. Please turn it back or whatever. But Mark Zuckerberg, looking at the data, is just seeing people click through the roof.
Higher engagement.
Yeah. And so he's behind the scenes being like, oh no, they really love it. So you have this stated intention of like, we hate this, take it away. And then this behavior, which is like clicking like crazy. And you could come up with like a million examples like that, or just like even little things of, and some of these might be kind of funny. He had the data from Kindle or whatever, and the percentage of people who said they read the book, but actually stopped 40% of the way through and like didn't read it. Like we get all these kinds of things. See, this kind of is intuitive. Like we present ourselves, we lie to ourselves, we lie to others. But in all of that, you have this like this mismatch of a stated intention and a revealed intention. And obviously in a neoliberal system, in a market system, it doesn't care about the stated intention.
Of course.
It's only the revealed intention. But in those stated intentions, I think there's some really, there's a lot of intelligence.
Yeah, that's morality. That's conscience.
Yeah.
It's like it's the voiced, it's like the voiced, if I was just revealed intentions, it's like, well, someone's got a, nice hot sandwich that's theirs, but like, I really want it. So I'm just going to, it's like, no, the whole morality is, it's like the Freudian ego, id, superego. Yeah. It's like that voice that is like telling you, hey, even though you feel this way, this is wrong. Yeah. And it's like, that's morality. And,
and even if it's just like not even like a social form of morality like that, and it's just, I don't know, the vision of man and human, sometimes when they say, they're expressing like, I want to not like this thing. I want to be in a world where I'm doing something different. The stated intentions, not that they're always perfect, right? They could be polluted by all kinds of things, but I think we should take them more seriously. And obviously neoliberalism it's totally blind to them. It laughs at them. In fact, when you find that mismatch, like he was writing in this chapter, you've struck gold as a capitalist, because like the things that people will do secretly clicking around. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the libertarian flaw. And I fear that the neoliberal bleed of that same rationality, that same blindness into areas which are before we're kind of closed off to it, is a disaster. I've been coming to this kind of fortune cookie, like little tag of, I feel the tension, so much tension in the world and in the human animal is because our behavior is misaligned with our nature, and something's going to break. Like, people are feeling this, like we're building this world, we're going along with this thing, we're behaving in a certain way, but we know it's not
so
really of us or what we can be. Yeah.
So let me ask you then.
Yeah.
What do we do about it? Because then, in my mind, it's like, well, I mean, I still respect the libertarian considerations of, hey, if you're going to make policy, chances are it's going to produce outcomes you never intended. So as much as I want to say, no new iPhones, we're done. We're at iPhone 16. We have Apple Intelligence. We're done. You don't need another one. Why is like, I get, you can tell I get like angry about it. So it's like, we don't need a new iPhone every year. Yeah. Oh my God in heaven. Otherwise. So what practically, I mean, because there's the discussion of it and just the awareness of, man, recognizing that I'm in a system that is technically at odds, with my stated interests, and is just appealing to my base instincts. Just being aware of that in an articulated sense and knowing that other people are aware of it, it's like, that's good. That is genuinely useful. Like, there's a part of me that's like, I'm legit gonna get a flip phone in the next couple months and switch out of an iPhone.
I got the smallest phone I could possibly find that's
nice.
A smartphone.
Okay. Yeah. I might do something like that because it's just absurd. But like, as a matter of practical politics, what are things how do we defeat the neoliberal entity?
Yeah, this is a big question, obviously. And I don't know if you'd be satisfied with my answer, but something's going to break. So I think we haven't really talked about this aspect of the neoliberal. We've talked about it from a human level, of that it mismatches our most transcendent desires, whatever we want to call them. And I think that's true. But there's another aspect to it, which I don't know how Milton Friedman, I think he did lose some arguments, maybe with me in my own head, sure. But it's an open question. I'm curious how you think. It's an open question of whether, let's just call it global capitalism, whatever, requires exploitation. And this is an old leftist trope, but I think a difficult one to escape. So just imagine this thought experiment right now of, if everyone in the world, like, I know Steven Pinker, I've sat on stage with his stuff before. I know all the graphs going in this direction. And they're convincing, right? A lot of libertarians are like, look, it's working, stay the course. Everyone just so like,
far.
Yeah, so far. And obviously, as I said, the justice thing, I think they totally misunderstand that even if that graph is going great, but you have 2% of the world suffering a massive injustice, that even if you threw a lot of nice fancy cars at them, they would blow it all up because of the injustice. And I think that's a truth. But regardless of that one, imagine everyone in the world right now, you and I probably live fairly comfortable lives and have whatever kind of decently long lifespans we're having or whatever. And you and I aren't working in a mine somewhere, and we're not in a factory putting pieces together. Imagine every single person in the world. And this is supposedly the goal, like to get people from the mines and from the factories where they're not getting paid enough to some other existence where they have more material, Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the bottom level is sort of like leveled up a little bit. Imagine the entire world was transformed in such a way. I think every good, who's going to work in the factories, then every good immediately would become insanely expensive. Like, I don't know how, like, that does it. And if everyone's living, let's say twice as long, 200 years, like, would everyone retire at 70 or whatever?
Yeah,
that's
like a whole other problem. That's like a transhumanist problem.
Yeah. But like the system, and I think, again, like it's hard to refute it in my view, relies on the exploitation of someone else. It's a zero-sum game. And yes, I understand it could raise all, the rising tide raises all boats or whatever. But you've got, like, I think, again, there's two ways to answer this. It's going to break because of the injustice or because of the practicality. When I did an interview with Vijay Prashad in the Open, I start with a pop quiz. I could give it to you now if you didn't watch it, or your viewers. Names.
I think I did
You
watch
it?
But remind me give me the pop quiz anyway.
Yeah, your viewers could watch it. It was, gosh, I might get the year wrong. I think it was 2075. In 2075, it's the year 2075 now, and this is like projected by good statisticians. Name the top 3 populous cities on Earth. The 3 cities that have the most people on planet Earth.
This.
Yeah,
so you probably in Africa, right? It's like Nairobi or
Kinshasa's number 1, Dar es Salaam's number 3 or 2, I think, and I think there's one in Chad, I can't even pronounce it, Tigny or something. I don't know. Like it's like with like 80 million people projected in these places. So on a practical level, they're going to want some damn dignity, and they're going to want some attention. And I think that's going to break the system unless something drastic happens. And then
automation and AI
level.
Isn't the ultimate goal, if it does require exploitation, or does require, whatever you call it, let's call it exploitation of people at the bottom. Well, what if that gets replaced with automation and augmented with automation, such that all the miners are not humans, and that everyone gets raised above that, and we put automation at the base.
This is possible. This is sort of like a techno-utopian vision of just enslaved robots, I suppose, or automation in the mines or whatever.
You can't enslave robots. Robots don't have rights.
This is true.
I'm a robophobe, and I support robophobia, and I think we should normalize it ASAP, and we should not be creating anything we should not be playing God, even though you don't believe in God. I don't think we should be playing God by trying to create conscious life, because whatever
I don't think we can, but yes, it'll be a disaster.
I hope not. Whatever. But I do certainly think we can, instead of having AI take all the artist's job and ruin everything, like in ways that no one wants it to produce better algorithms to addict you more. It's like, put it in to reduce inefficiencies in government, in production lines, all that stuff. That's a good use for it. And that's the optimistic case. Yeah. And you're saying that's a possibility, but not necessarily.
I guess it could happen. I'll just say, like, I don't think we'll get to that point, because I do think so here's like the big takeaway. I've been, so I'm writing this book, and I think I've changed the name recently, but I'm calling it The Insufficient Rewards, which is a reference to Leon Festinger and the cognitive dissonance experiments he did. I don't know if you want me to walk through them, but it's I think really important to what we were talking about human nature, and if we are creating a world that is not genuinely what we want, or what we truly transcendently desire, because we live, this might even bleed over to some of the Israel-Palestine stuff, but those of us in the West, I'm talking to those of us in the comfortable West, whatever that we call it, or the global North, we have these lives around us, and they are materially okay, although there's instability in the system and all that. And there is this growing awareness, maybe because of technology showing it to us more, that there's people on the edges of this thing that are living pretty awful, suffering lives. The phones you talked about, we could talk about cobalt mines in Congo and everywhere else, that are a part of the system which has delivered this to us. And the more, optimistic libertarians say, well, it will deliver it to them. Just wait, be patient. Eventually. And I think their patience is running out. People like Pankaj Mishra with Age of Anger wrote a really good book about that. They've been really patient, and they've been screwed. We could talk about Africa. But I think seeing the suffering, again, we could talk about Palestine. That was a huge, Gaza has been a turning point for, I think, a lot of people, of if that suffering, if that awful thing I'm seeing is a necessary ingredient, some sort of collateral damage of this world that is delivering this thing to me around here. And if I'm honest with myself, this thing is kind of an insufficient reward to begin with, like to buy my silence and my dignity and me looking the other way, or just walking past the homeless guy on the street or whatever. I think that's the point of the globe we're at now, and there's a big breaking point since October 7th and after, and why Zionism, and people are talking about colonialization and the global South. I think that we're at a real fork in the road with that conversation. And interestingly, in the West, with people maybe who tracked what I just said of like, this is an insufficient reward. And if you're telling me it involves what I'm seeing on my phone and bombs dropping on kids' heads or whatever it is, I'm out. Like, I don't care how many, new video games you throw my way, I'm out. And there's got to be a different way to do this. This doesn't mean burn it all down. It doesn't mean video games are bad. It doesn't mean, material wealth is an enemy or something. But no, this system cannot be producing that in order to produce this, especially when this reward is bullshit. And, it's kind of like people used to scoff at, it was a meme of like first world problems, 10 years ago or whatever. And then people would make fun of like, oh, they got my latte size wrong. I'm so upset. First world problems versus like the split screen of like some kid in Africa who like can't get water. And you're like, come on, get over yourself and your privilege. But people laughed at it and scoffed at it a bit too much. Maybe the libertarian being, trying to be a utilitarian in that sense of like focus on this problem over here. But I think it's time, at least in the West, we get ahead of that first world problems. And maybe a lot of what I'm talking about there, like, oh, you're spiritually unfulfilled. Oh, poor you and your Porsche or whatever. Like, right. No, these are legit philosophical conversations to have. These are legit spiritual conversations to have, because where are we driving this thing anyway? Like if we're miserable here with all of our toys, and then we're telling Africa, just wait, we're going to give you the misery. It'll be more comfortable. You could eat, but you'll also be like, well, then what's the point? There's got to be a different way. And to get to that world, if we're going to have to stomp on so many, kids and like all this awful stuff that we see in the world, like, I'm out. There's got to be a different way to do this. I didn't answer anything specifically of how to do this, because I do think this is like, maybe you feel the same. There's like a global tension and things are really breaking. And I don't think we're going to have much of a choice other than to like, unfortunately, I don't think it had to go this way, but fight this thing out and figure out what comes next. Because, the last century, Francis Fukuyama writing The End of History, like, sorry, buddy, like, no, that was just World War I and World War II were just the little like prequels of a bigger thing, of a world that is struggling to reconfigure itself, and global reconfigurations of philosophies and arrangements are usually violent. I don't think they have to be, but we're kind of going there. And so I don't know, dude, like, we need something better. Yeah.
The whole concept of accelerationism is something I'm increasingly sympathetic to. I mean, it means a lot of different things, but the idea that, the night is darkest before the dawn, in order to get to a better place, it seems inevitable that, things have to break and there has to be significant tension. There's my optimistic view of like, well, wouldn't it be great to have a peaceful revolution, a velvet revolution in the United States, let's say, and have a second constitutional convention where we can all get together and say, hey, we did it the first time and we got some things right, freedom of speech and all that. We were a little late on the whole, ending slavery, but here we are. What are the things that we know now that we should implement in here? Like, what are the key things? And that's where I ask, what's the pragmatic thing? I don't think you can say only one new iPhone every 4 years. It's like that, that seems impractical. But, this idea that like, well, if we reshored manufacturing, which is something I'm sympathetic to. I mean, just even for practical reasons of, well, probably China shouldn't be manufacturing our antibiotics. We shouldn't rely on that supply chain in the event of global, supply chain issues. But the idea of like, I would rather have the new iPhone cost $2,500 and have less people buy it and have more people in America have a job than what it is now. But the question is, what do we do? I really do think it is like a bottom up. We need a spiritual revolution. I mean, it sounds so out there, but like, this is one area I'm beyond ignorant in history in general, but like the idea of like great awakenings and spiritual revivals and stuff, it's like, and this is why the whole thing I talk about on my channel is we're in a meme war, right? It's a war of ideas. I'm less concerned about, well, what did the Republicans do today? And what did the Democrats do today? And because I have no control over that in any practical sense. But I do think it's like, look, none of these problems are going to be solved at the policy layer. I do think there's going to be a break of some kind. And then that produces it, assuming we don't all get wiped out, there'll be then an opportunity. There'll be an opportunity to reform and rejuvenate out of that. And I have no idea what that looks like. But that's why it's thinking of like, well, you know, yeah, what would a second constitutional convention look like? What would we do properly and reform things? Like one practical thing, I'm a big fan of civil service, mandatory civil service the day you turn 18. Like there's many things to criticize Israel about, but the fact that they require everyone to do military service, I'm like, that's spiritually, I think that's a good thing. I've done jury duty one time in my life, and I felt like I was in a movie. I felt like I was in like almost a Christmas Carol type thing, where I got into the jury room, and it was like an archetypal cross section of life. There was like a construction worker, a history teacher of American civics, some like 22-year-old girl, people from like literally every walk of life here together in this, I would say technically like civic liturgical kind of construction, like the courthouse, where it's like, all right, the guys, they're wearing a robe. There's all these like, like in a church you have stained glass windows with like Latin phrases on it. It's like, it's not that different that from a courtroom. It's like, we're administering justice here. This is a place of, you don't lie under oath. It's like, there was the first time in my life where I felt connected to my fellow American citizens in a way that I'd never been before. And I think civil service, fostering that connection and building community, I mean, whether that's building community, but at least building the grounds of connections so that I don't feel like my neighbors are completely different people or people who have a different, class are entirely something else. Because, the whole thing with like Luigi Mangione, and it's like everyone's celebrating this. It's like, it's not like I don't understand why, but to the point about things are going to break at some point. It's like, look at all the fact that people view that positively at all is an indication of how screwed up the system is. Yeah. And, I don't, something like a civil service would bind people of like, no matter how much money no matter how much money your parents have, for 2 years, you get 3 hots and a cot, and you do, clean up the streets in Southside Chicago, work in an old person's home, do military stuff if you so choose. It's like, I don't know. That's like a thing that I know would never happen outside of a major reformation, a major revolution. Yeah. And stuff like that, at least it's optimistic to try and conceptualize those type of things. But I don't know if you were because you already were in the first wave of the revolution with the IDW. If you were, was that the first wave? Yeah. So if you were in the, if you were in the Great Hall chambers as the Second Constitutional Convention is happening, and they're like, Jay, what do you think? It doesn't even have to be specific policy, but just, what the catastrophe has happened. We're in a rebuilding period. Yeah. It's like, what are you advising?
I mean, I think I'll answer it. I don't know specifically. I'll just go from this angle that we're at this point where we need a new story, which is what you're talking about. Like, we need a new story, what we're doing, who we are. I could talk as an American there, because you're kind of putting it in that phrase or in that frame. And, people are I think rightfully pointing out this Trump thing. You read this thing that I'm working on about that, really the honesty of Donald Trump, which is he's saying the quiet part out loud, right? Like I don't know which waves of the revolution I was in, but I was in college when 9/11 hit, and I was one of the people marching against the invasion of the Iraq War, which at the time was the largest global protest on earth. I think it's been surpassed by a lot of things now, but I was holding signs like everyone else that said no blood for oil, right? Because we were like, we know what this is about. Like, stop bullshitting us. We know what this is about. Like, you get called the conspiracy theorists for like Dick Cheney and Halliburton, and like, we're really going to liberate the people in Iraq. Like, is that really what we're going to do? And then they tried the WMD and like 9/11 stuff. And, the patriotic American I think was very confused. Like, wait, what's the story? We just need revenge. We somehow just need revenge and to get them back. And us leftists or whatever, or I don't know who was marching with me, but we're like, no blood for oil. Like, we know what this is. You're going there to take the oil. And at the time, we were probably laughed at or called unpatriotic, or were lectured to about how terrible Saddam Hussein is and don't the Iraqis deserve liberation? Right. Again, you can win all the arguments that way because like you can make that case, right?
It's like Daenerys Targaryen. I don't know if you've seen Game of Thrones.
No.
I won't spoil it, but yeah, there's basically a liberating ruler who says we will free these people and then ends up burning down the whole city in order to liberate them. But
yeah. And like, regardless of what we like, I mean, now what are we 25-ish years later, 20 years later from that invasion? I think it's non-controversial to be like, yeah, we took the damn oil. Like that's what we were there for. And, you know, Donald Trump saying the quiet part out loud, right? Now with these negotiations with Ukraine being like, yeah, we want the minerals. Like that's what we were there for. Like screw your sovereignty and like this weird story about what Joe Biden was saying, all that Democrat stuff of like lightness and darkness and closed and democratic and free, like go after yourself. We're there for America's interest, and America's interest is to get that rare earth minerals, and we want them in our sphere of interest. And like, there's a refreshing honesty to this conversation. There's a horrible nihilism to it, right? This is like a shit or get off the pot moment about the story of like, has this always just been about resources and protectionism, or you know, did we go to Vietnam to what have we been doing in the really post World War II? This is a pretty short-lived, crazy American empire, but we told this shining beacon on a hill story. The nice thing about the Trumpers is that they hate the Republican, the rhinos that they call them, whatever, and the Democrats, right? And for the leftists like myself, I'm like, we get that, right? The same people on the same stage who were just telling America and begging America to vote for their girl Kamala was George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and like Barack Obama. It's like that's the collection of all these people. And I don't, you know, like I'm not trying to ascribe sinister motivations to someone like Barack Obama or Biden or whatever, or Zelensky. I think they really believe the story. This is the depth of cognitive dissonance and telling yourself a story about why you're really doing something rather than just going to take minerals or whatever. I would urge everyone, this is a recommendation. It got nominated for an Oscar and it's so good. I'm a documentary filmmaker. Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. It's this like 3-hour long, really cool film that just got nominated for an Oscar and documentary. And it's a fusion of jazz, like black jazz, Louis Armstrong and Coltrane and stuff at the time in the 60s with the eventual assassination and murder of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. And it's a really cool film, like done in this, it's a very non-standard editing form, but you'll get a lot out of it. But like, I think in the immediate post-World War II world where colonialism was, in quotes, kind of ending, and places like Africa, which is just loaded with resources, are kind of one by one over the next decade getting their independence and talking about self-determination and how they're going to do this. And it's in the context, this is how Americans understand it, in the context of the Cold War, the CIA pulling off coups and assassinations left and right in Africa to make sure, so again, like they could couch it in this, like, we're fighting communism and we're trying to liberate them and bring them democracy. But like, who are you kidding here? And now with the sort of like clarity of hindsight of 60 years later or whatever, like the story, you wanted the resources, you wanted the relationships, you wanted to, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the Ghanaian leader, called it neo-colonialism. He wrote this book in 1966, was couped 2 years later from the CIA helping them, like, because he basically wrote the book. This neo-colonial arrangement of the world, that I think was in debate, right? For the American of like, what are we really doing? Are we trying to liberate the world? Is this about democracy, or is this just about feeding the empire and getting stuff? And with Donald Trump, I love the flag, right? The flag and the sign of no more bullshit, Donald Trump 2024. That's like the one that I've always been thinking of, like, what do they mean by bullshit? And for me, it's that. It's like, no more bullshit, America first. it's always been America first. Stop bullshitting us. Like, I don't care about liberating Ahmed in northern Iraq. I could give two shits about his life. I'm sure that's what a lot of Americans think. They're like, what about us? What about me? Oh, they have oil. That's what it's always been about. I don't give a fuck. Go get the oil. But here, to your question, and this is like a long way to get there about like what to do about this. Now it's an open question, and I'm a little afraid of the next decade because the question you talked about Israel there, Israel could tell a story for the last 60 or 70 years or whatever of, oh, they're just trying to live in peace and oh, we're just trying to live with our neighbors. And like that story, obviously, I think most people are seeing the bullshit of that story too. This has always been an expansionist. It was always headed here. Like, why did they build settlements every year since 1967? Yeah. Right. Yeah, again, like, and if that's, I'm not trying to like paint the entire place that way, but that's been the project. And they aren't shy about it. They were a proud colonialist project. They called themselves that. They worked with Cecil Rhodes, for God's sakes, in South Africa, the architect of apartheid. Like this wasn't a secret of what they were. And then this weird revisionist kind of trying to, anyway. But it's to the point of like, my point to you is about needing a new story is like, will you be able to get humans, get soldiers, get people to march and energize in that mission, right? Like, I don't know if you know any Iraq vets, but they went there with a lot of ideas in their head of what they're doing, including liberating these people. Like, it's crazy to send, bozo 18-year-olds into like the middle of Iraq to like try to bring democracy. I mean, it was an insane project, but in their heads, good for them. Some of them are like, we're trying to help these people and liberate these people. Many of them, of course, started to have doubts of like, I think this is about the oil because I'm just on a tank here, like circling the oil fields where American companies are now extracting it. Like, what am I really doing here? But, like if from the beginning, after something like 9/11 or any kind of endeavor we want to do, the story, if an American president got up and said, you know what, we want that thing and all that stuff, we deserve it, we're going to go take it and get it. Could you energize Americans to go point guns at people and kill them to take the stuff under their feet? I mean, that's the way it really was with overt colonialism. And now, like that, we're at that moment now. And I don't know how you feel about that. Israel is a scary endeavor because I think it is a little test case of you can get a large amount of people to do that, right? Like you can turn, it's not new or unique to Israel, but you could turn militaries into pretty overt colonial imperialist projects that are just doing what they're doing with very little pretense that it's about helping people. It could all become collateral damage for some greater future world, like we talked about, that might not be worth winning in the first place. But that's an open question now. That's an open question of like whether that's going to be possible if you can really energize people to pull the trigger for that kind of like overt project. I want to say there will be a large revolt against that it's not worth it, that's not, you need a story, you need a myth.
Yeah.
But you would need a myth to actually be better and deeper. And so like the last part I'll put out that, because I kind of went global with it, which is what I wanted to do, is what's tragic about the last century, the 20th century, is World War I was so bad. I don't know. I'm not a big TV watcher, so I don't know Game of Thrones and what he based it on. But everyone knows J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was written and based on his experiences in World War I. And everyone was like, no, that's like the end of the world kind of stuff. Mm. And World War I was super, super bad, but it wasn't enough. And then we had World War II. So out of the ashes of World War I was like, holy shit, that was a big problem. And everyone knew the kind of technology we were developing, which included planes dropping bombs from the sky near, in the 20s and 30s a little bit later, but people could see what was coming of the destructive power we had. And then we had, the first effort at the UN with Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations getting together, being like, hey, I think we need a global conversation table because that was really bad. And the word there was self-determination. This was Woodrow Wilson's dream about self-determination, about people should be able to determine themselves in countries. Obviously, the idea of self-determination is greatly at odds with colonialization, right? And then a ton of people showed up in Versailles in, was it 1919, at that convention, like including like Africans being like, cool, the self-determination thing sounds great. What about us? And, everyone's like, wait, we didn't mean the black people.
Yeah.
It's like, we just kind of meant European powers. Anyway, that League of Nations project crumbled pretty quickly, obviously. And then we had World War II, which was also super bad. Out of the ashes of World War II, we're like, hey, we need that table, guys. Did you see those bombs in Japan? Like, we scared the shit out of ourselves, which I think also leads to a lot of the neoliberalism, by the way. But then we had the UN. And frankly, it was like a step closer to like a more egalitarian, like one nation, one vote. But of course, this is 1946, 47. Most of Africa is still colonized. They're trying to fight for a seat at the UN. This will be in that movie if you watch the soundtrack of the coup d'etat, by the way, of like what was happening there. But we still have the Security Council with these 5 countries basically who happened to win World War II, who could veto everything. And we see how that's now playing out. And if the UN collapses, which my prediction, I've been making this since Trump was running, I think sometime in the next 4 years, it probably won't pass. There'll be a motion or a conversation brought by Republicans to revoke our membership to the UN of the United States. It'll be like the first hints at this crumbling. But if that crumbles, we'll likely have World War III. Who the hell wants to see that? And out of the ashes of that, we might get something. But I think a future historian would view last century, and unfortunately probably continuing into this one, as a global order of politics that was based on imperialism and colonialism in the 1900s, and then probably violently in stutter steps towards this more egalitarian global conversation that we'll see what comes out of it. But I think because what I said about the exploitation built into something like neoliberalism and capitalism, it will be a different conversation about the economics and the way things are arranged and whatever. I mean, the first hints of these things, if anyone wants to like look at Gaddafi when he was killed, but that NATO did it, there's no surprise he was also starting to talk about a Pan-Africanism again.
Yeah,
and a golden
like a common
dinar,
currency, right?
A currency that they could trade the oil, not in the dollar. They were like, forget you, you're done. And so, so that's my hint of like, we need a new story, but frankly, the seeds of the story, like you said, the American Constitution, the original one, whatever, Woodrow Wilson, like it's all there. We can revive it, but we just have to actually have more courage to live it. And
yeah.
That's
so
where I'm at.
Interesting. Even as even as we're talking about like League of Nations, because I grew up with a lot of conservative ethos on me. So I have a lot of conservative stereotypes in my mind of like, well, the UN, globalist, all that stuff. Yeah. Although it's had its advantages. But like even as you're talking, it's like, in principle, there was nothing wrong with the League of Nations mission. The problem is it's built on lies.
Yeah, and America didn't even join it, by the way. Americans were like, we left Europe to get away from that nonsense. They were isolationists, but it was a failure from the beginning.
Hypocrisy. It wasn't the principle that was the issue.
Right.
It was self-determination. Oh, except for Sykes-Picot, we're going to draw a straight line through Iraq, and this is. And by the way, anyone who attempts to change this is now violating the rules-based liberal order. It's like. It's this idea of like, well, X went wrong and X aimed for this thing. Therefore, the thing it was aiming for must be wrong. It's like, no, there's many other considerations.
Don't you think that's what the Trump moment is now? Of like, they're throwing away, in a strange way, their Trump movement is a nihilistic way of saying we can't achieve this beautiful story. It's always been a Hobbesian dog-eat-dog world. Who are we kidding ourselves? No more bullshit. Now it's time for America to eat. Forget everyone else. And I that's like a disappointment to me. But
so the way I see it, first off, I mean, in your essay describing Trump as like I think the point that I liked the most was the whole turning Gaza into Riviera. It's like, that's something he would do. Yeah, like, you can give me a better deal? You can give me a better deal? You burn down Mar-a-Lago for $80 million? Good, I got you. It's like, there's no justice there. And there's a particular type of person that, is very much has that mindset. But I can be quite certain the Palestinians are not of that mindset. But that's kind of a separate issue. But there is something to be said about, like, what is the optimistic future? Like, what is the future look? It's like, I do think that this goes back to the point about we need to tell it. What's the story? I mean, ultimately, that's what it is. What is the vision that we are moving towards? This is Jordan Peterson points this out as like we need a common vision to unite us to move forward. And increasingly now, I need to make that connection better, because that's sort of what I'm doing with the whole great meme war type thing. It's like we're in a war of ideas, but we need to get the ideas right and the goalposts right, or the not the goalpost, but the destination. And there is something to be said about, like, well, there's different meme complexes in the world. There's the American sort of like Western values. Western Enlightenment values that have a respect for sort of the religious underpinnings. That's sort of the ultimate meme that I'm like, that needs to win. That meme needs to achieve global mimetic hegemony. How do we get to a point where those values become the dominant world values? Now, in some sense, they are, in the form of secularism and neoliberalism. Those have sort of dominated, right? Like India, for example, obviously has the Hindu caste system, but it's illegal there to abide by the. I don't know the full details, but I know that it's illegal to like discriminate. And that's purely a consequence of the Western Enlightenment meme winning out the Hindu nationalist meme, right? And so that needs to continue. Of course, what that meme is, if it's just neoliberal, like, do whatever's in your short-term interests, then we're screwed. But this is my point about like a great awakening, a spiritual revival. I am sympathetic to the idea that, in the event of a crash, you need to secure your own mask before you secure others. And it's like, well, if there's any country that is going to be the host of the spiritually revived meme, I do think it's the United States. I don't know what else it would be. It's not China. It's probably not Russia. Europe, maybe. But like the idea that, all humans are of equal divine worth is like is an assumption in the Enlightenment, but which is in my mind clearly comes from a Christian framework. I'm sympathetic to the idea that, well, maybe America should be first, so that we're in the position to be able to
this
make a
is
difference.
Sort of a John Mearsheimer in a weird way. Is like I
love John Mearsheimer, by the way.
Realpolitik kind of guy.
Yeah.
But can I throw a wrench in this? I always have questions about this Western value thing and what it really is and what it means. I hear this Judeo-Christian value stuff, and I'm just so unsure about it. I'm always skeptical that it's not just a veneer for some story we're trying to tell ourselves and erase our own history. I mean, like, we legalized gay marriage like yesterday in the West. Is this like some old Judeo-Christian value that suddenly took like centuries to get there? But let me give you like a little thought experiment with this Western value thing, because if I put you in a time machine, and I don't know how much you know of the history, but I'll give you what I know of it because I'm just writing about it. If I put you in a time machine to around the year like 1830, 1835, you're in Texas right now, actually. It'll bring you a little bit to the east. And so this is, the colonies are, Manifest Destiny does not yet have a name. It gets named in 1854 or something by this journalist, but the meme of it, as you're saying, is sort of entrenching, right? Like we're starting to the Americas are starting to push westward. And obviously there are great conflicts because this land is not empty. There are Native Americans who've been there for millennia and have very, detailed nations and religious cultures and languages and histories. And we tend to just erase them all as sort of like unenlightened savages, which is a bit of a habit of like a Guns, Germs, and Steel or Yuval Noah Harari history, which isn't quite held up by the archaeology actually. But would you, if I zoomed you into 1830, there's a conference going on. This really happened. The Pan-Indian Conference, right? We hear about Pan-Africanism, post-war, but Pan-Indian Conference, and a guy named Tecumseh, who was a leader, is calling this Pan-Indian Conference together and realizing the threat of the white man and the European and their westward plans, and is getting a little bit annoyed and frustrated at the disunity that he's seeing within the Indian front to confront this. Like some people are selling, and he's like, you don't have any right to sell the land. They don't believe in that. Like tons of the Indian, they didn't have private property like memes or whatever. And basically trying to unite a pan-Indian nation to confront this and propose an actual land, a nation. Imagine that, a two-state solution in a conflict near the Great Lakes, and they had defined borders and rivers and all this kind of stuff. Would you, if I zoomed you into that moment, mind you, this Western Enlightenment people are arriving there with all their technology and supposedly Christian ideas, are enslaving Black people. There's enslaved Black people, which most of the Native American tribes were horrified by and saying, I can't believe these barbaric people are doing this to these other people. There were a few Native American tribes that had African slaves as well, but for the most part, Tecumseh and others were like, these awful people are doing this. Yeah. Would you make a case? And by 1830-ish, there'd been a lot of violence and cycles of violence where, if you were going to make a case defending this Native American plan, being like, you know what, they should have their own land and we should have a two-state solution or coexistence, whatever it is, you would be met with arguments about how they raid towns and they scalp men and they rape women and they kidnap girls, which some happened, right? Like we would call them terrorists now. They were called other things then. There was one newspaper called them red-faced tigers or something, like amazing. I'm going through a lot of the history of like the language of condemnation that's used in the newspapers. You would also get told that they have these insane religious ideas. And even actually a little bit after Tecumseh gets killed by one of the future presidents of America, but his younger brother gets even more, let's say, radicalized. And he calls himself the prophet. And he says the white man is the spawn of the scum of the earth. And the red man is the great spirit's children. And we need to drive them into the ocean. I mean, this sounds quite familiar, right? Push them into the sea. That's like, everyone knows the parallels I'm drawing here. But if I just zoomed you into 1830, knowing all of that, I don't know where you would identify the supposedly Western value and who you think in some utilitarian math should win this. And then even before you answered, this is another thing about the leftist. If I gave you a button that said, because history didn't have to go the way it went. History feels inevitable afterward, but it's not. It could have been different. If it didn't happen, if I gave you a magical button that was like, you know what, Paul, you're such a good orator that you actually convince all the Americans that like, this is the wrong way to go, and the Native Americans should get their own nation and whatever. They might think it's a raw deal. There might be some still problems there, whatever, but like they're going to have this nation and they're going to work it out and we're going to live as best as we can side by side. And the manifest destiny idea sort of never manifests. It sort of stops maybe in Louisiana or whatever. And that's the way history went. And if I told you, hey, if you press that button, Paul, in the future, here's a bunch of Steven Pinker graphs. Like life expectancy might not be as good, and things like the progress may have been in the technological way, like not quite as good. And there's like an 80% chance that that's the world that you're producing by pressing this button, or you can not press the button and let it go the way it went in the world we live in. Now the leftist, this is a really point to drive home, presses the button because of the imperative of justice, even if it like is guaranteed or mostly guaranteed or more probable to produce a world that potentially has what, Steven Pinker would call more suffering, because we leftists value the justice as a, like we think the way that non-leftists, I would say, or utilitarians, probably most libertarians, are measuring and weighing flourishing and suffering is flawed, because flourishing, justice as a variable in flourishing is like a necessary one or a huge one, and something that might look like suffering when there's justice can even have a lot of flourishing within it. And so I don't know how you answer that, but thought experiments like that, and I want to put that on your plate because I've just done a lot of travel in Africa and had a lot of experience there. They kind of bristle at this Western values kind of pompousness because of what I just put you. They're like, you know what, like you said, the plane's crashing, take care of yourself first. And they're like, yeah, but you guys crashed the plane, right. You did this to us. And so this it feels unjust on many levels. I don't know if you want to respond.
Well, on that last point, I would say I'm looking at it the same way that I was looking at the League of Nations thing, which is like, well, the League of Nations, it failed, but it wasn't the aim per se. It was the underlying hypocrisy and the lies that it was built on. And so the Western values thing, neoliberalism came out of Western values. So, the thing that I am critiquing is a spawn of those values, so to speak. Mm-hmm. The Native American, it's like, these hypotheticals are tough because, it's like, well, would I go back in time and press the button that removes my existence in the future. It's like, maybe kind of
the Marty McFly.
Yeah, but like, well, but it's kind of like, we'll go back even further. It's like, well, why were there Europeans in the West to begin with?
Sure.
Well, because of religious oppression. So maybe the real issue was Martin Luther and the Catholic Church. Maybe that should have been resolved. And then we go, and it's like, where do you go back? But specifically for the Native American thing, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's so hard to say. My gut is I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. It's like, I would reduce life expectancy. I better reduce material wealth. And to be honest, I believe that now of like, this is an extreme thing. But like, this is an expression of my feelings. Ban soda, ban all of the shit that is just like garbage, and get all of the trucks carrying soda off the road so that we can make, healthy food cheaper. But what about my freedom? Like, fuck your freedom, right? It's like, now, do I believe that? No, there'd be problems with that. But that's kind of my mindset. And it's so, yeah, like, well, maybe we should have everything east of the Rockies or east of the Mississippi or whatever. Like, fine, that's what, the United States. And I do believe in the idea that I learned this from I grew up Christian. And they were always telling people, like, because the purpose of Christian is evangelism, right? Bring people to church. They're like, go, and then ask your friend, just come to church with me, and they were very like big on that, right? But the thing that, to their credit, that they recognized was, what the best way to bring people to church is? To be a good person, and to have people go, man, what is it about that person that's like makes them good? Yeah. And I heard that reaffirmed later on in life from a friend who did Alcoholics Anonymous. And they're like, we don't advertise, we attract. It's not about advertising, it's attraction. This idea that if you do what is right morally and you set your own life straight, inherently it will attract people, right? Your memes will spread whether or not you are intentionally spreading them. So there is an idea of like, well, what if we did stop the manifest destiny stuff and just said, focus on the spiritual well-being of our people, and it's like, well, look at all the good we're doing. Now, of course, there's all kinds of problems with that, because you still have slavery, homophobia, and all that stuff. Yeah. And look, there are practical considerations of like, there's practical realities of why things took so long. Well, religion had such a repressive view of sexuality. It's like, well, for most of human history, there were no condoms, no birth control, and one STD could wipe out an entire race. So did it make sense to be like, hey, if you have sex with more than one person, we're going to, flog you or whatever? Or like Hammurabi's code, where like a thief would get his arm cut off. It's like, well, if they didn't have, it's easy to catch shoplifters now. 1 out of every 10 were caught in the past. And so arguably it was much more humane in a moral development to only chop a hand off rather than just execute them outright, Yeah. It's like there are these practical considerations. But yeah, to your point, I mean, it's hard to say.
But can I throw something else into it that I think is just like bigger, because it's to that same point, but it's because I think where we're at, to bring this to like a practical, what we do or whatever, and I don't know how to say any of this without just sounding like some like floaty lefty, softy, but we're stuck constantly as a species because I'm saying the word justice a lot, and I did an essay where I talked about unjust riches, and I walked through this example. I won't do it all here, but people can find it on my site. But I understand fully that certain injustices cannot be satisfied.
Right. Yes, you've talked about this. I've seen you on Benjamin Boyce. You talked the windows.
Oh, good. Yeah. I did it with Benjamin.
Right.
Yeah. So I walked through it on my site with like this weird,
which makes total sense.
Cool. Yeah. And I think to bring in now like the woke thing, I think one of the mistakes of the woke is to sort of rightfully be frustrated by an injustice that was never satisfied, but then kind of flail at sometimes cringy, silly ways to think it can be addressed.
Yeah,
right?
Not recognize that the window has been closed, right?
Yeah, but and then the important takeaway, though, for the libertarian or the neoliberal or anyone is to recognize when the window is closed, it doesn't mean the residue of the injustice disappears. In fact, it's even worse, right? It's just like, so I do recognize that this is an eternal problem. We're never going to reach some state of like perfect everyone feels this sense of justice. History is full of injustices, and we're always playing catch up, and they really do close. But the practicalities of not stopping that train, I just said you can't be stopped, but addressing it with more courage and more faith, to borrow a Christian word there, but more courage and less fear is what I've been calling like the slave owner's dilemma, so we brought up slavery there in the 1800s. And a lot of people have been using the Nat Turner analogy you've probably seen it with the Palestinians and sort of
John Brown, right?
Yeah, and understanding how awful violence. Nat Turner, they were like chopping kids up, some of them in school, and on a rampage, how violence can be righteous and still insanely regrettable and lamentable.
Right.
And so what's interesting about the Nat Turner thing is it happened after Haiti. And Haiti is like a funny thing that I'm like you, I grew up in an American education system, and Haiti is this thing we just kind of I just think like memory hold the entire story of Haiti. It's the only country in the entire Western hemisphere that ranks in the bottom 20 on the Fragile State Index. It's the only one. It's like this outlier. And the history has been very unkind. Talk about justice and injustice, right? The really brief version of Haiti's history, it was the only massively successful slave revolution in history, right? The slaves revolted against the French and started to take over the plantations and kill everyone pretty much in their path who was getting in their way. There was a lot of slaughter, a lot of death. They were probably going to take over the whole island of Hispaniola, and then the Spanish basically cut a deal with their leader, Toussaint, whatever his name was, to stop. And that's why Haiti has this like line, and this way, and Dominican Republic's this way, and they speak Spanish. Anyway, Haiti was a successful slave revolution where the black slaves took over the island and won, and then immediately was, of course, isolated by all the colonial powers who weren't so happy with it. And look at Haiti now. It's awful. But that's a good example of like, would you press the button to do it, knowing how Haiti turned out, which is a nightmare, versus not, to just like live under slavery. And I think any leftist would be like, press that damn button. But the point I'm telling here is like the newspapers around the time and the conversation in the Americas in the 1800s into the 1850s, whatever, let alone the Native Americans, I think the conversation about the immorality of slavery was winning the day long before slavery was abolished in the Civil War. And all of the newspapers in the South were constantly writing about Haiti, like remember Saint Domingo. And the philosophy that even after Nat Turner did his thing, there was one newspaper in Boston called The Liberator, which was a lefty abolitionist newspaper, which I think was brilliant with this one paragraph that said something like the lamentable, regrettable, horrible events of Nat Turner should only underline the injustice of slavery and refocus our energies, right? Like the kind of thing that maybe people like me, who I did an essay called Do You Condemn Hamas, are making those same kind of noises about like, listen, it didn't have to happen. Don't want any of this. This is awful. And on a spiritual level, I did something in that video about condemnation, which people would probably like. But like, dude, this should just underline the injustice. And anyway, different conversation, but not totally, because all of the Southern papers weren't making this case after Nat Turner being like, slavery is great, we should keep it forever. It was just, don't you remember Haiti? Do you want that to happen to you? Like, it's kind of like, you know what you've done to these people, and if you remove the chains, they're going to kill you, and they're going to take over the whole island and kill you. And most times in history, this is a massively exaggerated fear. Most times when you give people or persons their freedom, which did not happen in Haiti, they took it, right? It wasn't like the French were like, hey, you're free, and then they all got killed out of revenge. It was like, it was a war. Most times when you grant people, the same conversation happened in South Africa with the whites who were sure, they said, granting the blacks their freedom means a genocide for us. It was like, they believed it. And it didn't happen. Not that South Africa's perfect. This is a process. Like, injustice takes a long time to reconcile.
Yeah.
But that fear is the one on a global scale I think we're really worried about. It like scales up all these fears that we have of like, they won't forgive us. They won't forgive us because I know what I've done to them. And so the only way out of this is to just go further, to go the whole way, or convince yourself that it's righteous and God is on your side and it's collateral damage. We know all of the justifications, but I think at its base is this fear of the slave owner's dilemma. And we just need to have more courage. History, I think, can be an encouraging aspect to this that we should learn more of like what happens when you actually grant people or persons, or you try to acknowledge the injustices you've done in a legitimate way. It takes a lot of courage. And I'm not promising it's always clean. This is the hard part. A bomb will go off. Somebody will not be able to get over it, right? Like Peter Beinart has a new book. I'm interviewing him this week, actually. I'm very excited, called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, which is I think, going to be a hugely impactful book for people in my family. And in it, he mentions what we're all knowing, what we're all fearing of, I might get his name wrong, Al something, the guy who's the head of the Islamic Jihad, which is one of the many groups who's in there doing killings and fighting the IDF and whatever else. I might be getting the details a little wrong here, but he was a kid in 1956 when he saw the IDF slaughter and kill his father and uncle and I think one other people or whatever. He was a kid and he grew up and he became this. This doesn't mean it always is the case for why people fall into this, but how many of us are just wondering how many kids, and really trying to concentrate on what that looks like. Like you and I have fathers, we have families, like it's a horrible thought, but to think and picture, to close your eyes of like what that would look like, to see them killed in front of you, or even just humiliated to like, broken rib and crying, whatever the hell it is that you're imagining. It's probably worse than you're imagining. That, as a kid is tough to grow out of. So I cannot guarantee that an apology, a genuine political arrangement, one state, two state, right of return, whatever we could argue about, I can't guarantee and no one can guarantee that there won't be some people who just can't forgive and do some regrettable things. And those are the points to not freak out,
right, and
burn it all down and just go back to the war. Right. And I feel like that's an aspect of this that I can't guarantee, but I can tell you through studying history, it's almost always over exaggerated. And I think this is a Christian thing, maybe. I think we underestimate our power of forgiveness and the power to be forgiven to an extreme degree. And that would be the story. This is a difficult one. Back to your conversation of what I would do to a new story. And maybe this sounds like stupid lefty stuff to some of the people in your audience, but I think we in the West and the North, if we're going to tell the story about ourselves, it's going to have to be a pretty humble apology as well, or not apology, acknowledgement of, and what you're saying, failure to live up to our ideals, failure to be what we said we were going to be, to kind of acknowledge like, yeah, I think we were kind of captivated by the oil or whatever it was. And we got scared, and beg for forgiveness to a degree, but not in some stupid way where, this would, piss off the Trumpers or whatever, but in a way that's a genuine reaffirmation of what the project is on Earth that we all want to participate in together. And I think it's possible. I'm being like optimistic there, but darkest before the dawn, I think we're clearly going towards a more lean into the fuck it, no apologies, take what we want. And that's not just America and Trump. It's populating itself.
Right.
Modi in India, everywhere else. Yeah.
And I think we'll end with this and wrap up here, and then we can talk about what we'll talk about next time.
Yeah, I would love to.
I have some ideas. It's not lefty or whatever, lefty hopeful listening. It's like, look, there's a very significant strain of thought on the right that talks about American empire and the CIA coups, and perhaps there's more cynicism on that side that's not coming from compassion. It's like, well, hard to say. Candace Owens says some crazy shit, let's say. But I believe her when she says, like, I watched what happened in Gaza when I was pregnant, and it was just like, okay, that's there. And, Tucker Carlson has his flaws as well, again, putting it mildly. But he's talked about, like, you're talking about bombing like brown people, like, like, fuck you, and it's like this and reality is set up such that aligning yourself with what is moral provides you a competitive advantage. I do believe that. Now, obviously, you can find all these exceptions, and it's like, well, it's like having the high ground in a battle is always better, but that doesn't guarantee you'll win. But having the moral high ground in an ideological war is the best thing you can do to increase your chance of victory, let's say. Yeah, and on that topic, because I definitely, the next time we talk, we'll talk Israel Palestine more.
Yeah.
Because I want to bring out even what you talked about of like, let's say we take the forgiveness route. There's going to be backlash, but it's like, well, then what can we do to satisfy that? I don't know if you're familiar with Rene Girard.
No.
That we'll talk about it more next time, but it's essentially the idea of he came up with coined the term the scapegoat mechanism, which is essentially that, and it's a repeated process, not just in Christianity. But basically, what happens is religions will converge on this idea of we're going to pick one person or one group, pin all of our problems on them, and then wipe out the group or that person. Yeah. Christ is obviously the archetypal example of that. But the idea is like, well, you cannot achieve a sense of justice until the scapegoat is killed.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, can we apply that to Israel Palestine? It's like, I have an idea. Let's whether it's the UN or what other body, let's go get the Hamas people who butchered civilians. And then let's go get the Israeli settlers who killed Palestinians. And let's try them and deliver them justice both at the same time. And then, to spark the psychological thing of like, yeah, we both sides here have their excesses and ills, and justice should be served equally. Now, whether or not that will happen, we'll see. But, that's kind of an example I'm thinking of something to be done. But we can definitely talk about it more the next time.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Yeah. No, I'll wait for it. Yeah, because I have this interview with Peter Beinart, which might give you some insight.
Yeah.
Into where and how I'm thinking about that issue, which is obviously, insanely personal to me.
Right. Well,
and growing up.
Yeah. And there's another practical thing I want to talk about of like, to what degree is it appropriate to be uncautious with our words about like, well, Jews run the world, or Zog, or, Jews run the banks. It's like, well, and I think I told you when we first talked about my personal experience with certain people in my life who fell down the anti-Semitic rabbit hole. And I found repeatedly, it's like, they'll make the jokes about Jews this, Jews that. And I'll lean into that on purpose to show like, look, hey, I'm not going to judge you for making a shitty joke. But then what does that do? That opens the door of like, you do know you sound fucking insane, right? Like you do know I'll never bring you around any of my friends. And if you want to remain isolated for the rest of your life, you can do that. I won't condemn you for your jokes, but and I'd be curious to hear kind of your perspective as someone who's, Jewish about like all this different stuff, because it's easy to say Zog on my end.
No. It's plenty of Jews make those jokes behind closed doors and
well, that's
the big secret everyone knows.
I know. I'm intimately aware of that. Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, I could give you a pass. I could give you the card.
The Z word pass, Zog.
Yeah. All right, but no, we'll talk about that next time, because I do think, if your audience is interested at all in sort of what I was spewing there and laying out there, it's probably better said in my essays and whatnot. But I do think we do have to talk more about the Israel-Palestine issue, because it kept coming up as an example. It's really a linchpin for so much of the stuff we talked about. Love it or hate it or not, it's a breaking point, and it's not going to stop. It's not going to go away. We have to talk about it. It's like it's the
most divisive keystone issue right now, and it's divisive in a way that it's not left or right, really.
No. It's not.
It's orthogonal to that, which is unique. And that's where it's like, talk about things are going to have to break for things to change. It's like, well, this is kind of, we're approaching a point here, and getting this issue right is critical.
Yeah. Well, the masks are off with it. And so, but the last thing you said there about people on the right or whatever, like that's also part of my mission, is to like I told you at the beginning, I think leftism, or what I'm putting out as leftism, is you know, when like Donald Trump said the radical left was a bunch of radical leftists at like the USAID or something, it was like, come on, like literally could not be further from the truth of what leftism is.
Yeah,
so, like
CIA backed. Toppling
like
of governments,
right? Yeah. So like the crossover point of what you said there, like on Fox News and the right, and maybe Candace, people like that, it surfaces as like the deep state, whatever. But on the left, it just surfaces as sort of neoliberal empire behind the scenes, the true intentions of our endeavors in Guatemala or Africa or whatever, John Dulles. Like you could go through all this stuff. We agree on that. Like there might be a different sort of outcome of that, but like we know, we just have a different kind of approach to it. And that's masks off stuff now. But what's weird about Donald Trump is like he's tear down the deep state, but then just be like, we didn't need the deep state. We're just going to be honest about what the deep state was doing and just say it up front. So it's a very strange, like, yes. And I'll leave it there because maybe I will publish that essay before you put this out or when you put this out. I insist, if there's Trumpers watching or if you know people who are Trumpers, that you Trumpers are different as a man than Donald Trump. And I do think the Palestine issue points that out. And I think that's important. I understand completely the vote for him and the no bullshit and the stuff I talked about here. But as a man, I think you inherently understand why building the Riviera in Gaza and the Palestinian who says, you see that piece of rubble there, that's worth more than any palace in the world. I think you understand that. I'm from Pennsylvania, where I was able to like drift through a lot of different political arrangements. There's a proud people. You wouldn't leave your coal town for something that some Silicon Valley douche built for you on San Francisco, even if it was nicer. And I get that. Trump would make the move as long as it had enough gold and was worth more money. And, you know, that's just who he is. He's very, so no bullshit about what we've really been doing. But I hope this is the last, you know, I hope they've had their fun with Donald Trump and the middle finger is enough. Hopefully we could get through. But I know it goes back to my Occupy Wall Street days. Like we were all there together. And whether the Trumpers knew it or not, like your energy was there, the leftist energy was there, and the common enemy was the system and the deep state, whatever you want to call it on the right. But just the system is not paying attention to us, all of us, and we need to find ourselves again. The media was really good at splitting that up and lying about each part of it, but Occupy was a big moment, and it's time for another one. That's all I'm saying.
Spoken like a true radical centrist, Jay.
Whatever, fine, yeah. Well, I don't love it, but I don't know what the left. I don't know what it means.
Fair, I know. Well, maybe we all use a different label, but all serve the same meta meme. I'm thinking about making a video called the meta meme. It's like you can't. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's just as long as maybe it's just being a good person, right? Yeah. That's the meta meme, and you can be a radical leftist or you know, America First nationalist. But if we're all like, it's wrong to kill Palestinian children and then take their land, it's like, well, maybe it doesn't matter what we call the individuals. Maybe it's important that we have a diversity of labels so that we, you know, serve the meta meme. But yeah, topic for another time.
Cool, man. Cool.